Welcome. Tonight's story takes us deep into 1856 Tennessee, where a plantation hid a secret so disturbing it was buried underground, literally. What you're about to hear isn't folklore or rumor. It's pieced together from court fragments, personal letters, and plantation records that took serious time to cross, check, and verify. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And if you value true historical stories that demand real research and careful fact-finding, make sure you subscribe. Because uncovering truths like this doesn't come easy, and they deserve to be told right. In the rolling countryside of Tennessee in 1856, there stood a plantation that, on the surface, looked no different from dozens of others scattered across the region. It had wide fields, a main house perched slightly above the land, and rows of slave quarters tucked just far enough away to remain out of sight, but never out of control. Travelers passing through would have seen smoke rising from chimneys, heard the distant sounds of labor, and assumed life there followed the brutal, but familiar rhythm of plantation existence. But those who lived on the land knew something was wrong long before anyone from the outside noticed. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with the children. At first, it was subtle. A child who used to carry water buckets no longer appeared at dawn. Another who worked in the kitchens was suddenly sent away, according to the overseer. No explanation was ever the same. Sometimes the excuse was illness. Other times it was punishment or a claim that the child had been sold. But among the enslaved families, a troubling pattern emerged. Children were disappearing far more often than adults, and no one ever saw them leave the plantation. There were no wagons, no chains, no auctions witnessed down the road. They were simply gone. The plantation owner was known as a deeply controlling man, obsessed with order and silence. He believed children were a liability, too loud, too emotional, too likely to slow productivity. He reportedly despised crying, calling it noise that poisons discipline. Enslaved women were warned to keep their children quiet at all costs, especially near the main house. If a child was heard crying at night, punishment followed swiftly, not just for the child but for the mother as well. Over time, the children learned to stifle their voices, pressing fists into their mouths to keep from making a sound. Even so, the disappearances continued. The quarters grew unnervingly quiet. Mothers whispered to one another in the dark, asking the same questions again and again. Where had little Josiah gone? Why hadn't anyone seen Mary's boy since winter? Why were there fewer small footprints in the mud after rain? Some mothers were told their children had been moved to another property. But when relatives asked around, no neighboring plantation had seen them. Others were warned not to ask questions at all. One woman who pressed too hard was publicly beaten and accused of spreading lies. After that, fear sealed most mouths shut. What made the situation even more disturbing was that the plantation did not appear short of labor. In fact, the owner began boasting to visitors about his efficiency, claiming he had solved the problem of idle dependence. He spoke proudly of maintaining control and order, especially over the young. To outsiders, it sounded like cruel arrogance. To those who lived there, it sounded like a threat. Children were no longer seen playing in the dirt or sitting near their mothers during brief moments of rest. They were nowhere, in the fields, the kitchens, or the cabins. It was as if childhood itself had been erased from the land. At night, strange sounds were reported, low thuds beneath the earth. muffled cries that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some thought it was animals burrowing. Others believed it was their imagination, sharpened by grief and fear. But a few older men, who had worked the land long enough to know its natural sounds, were certain of one thing. The noises did not come from above ground. They came from below. There was an area near the main house where the soil always looked disturbed. Yet nothing was ever planted there. The ground would sink slightly after heavy rain, forming shallow depressions that no one could explain. Overseers warned everyone to stay away from that section of land, claiming it was unstable. Anyone caught wandering near it was punished. To the enslaved workers, that warning only made things more terrifying. Why protect a patch of empty earth so fiercely? The plantation owner's behavior grew more erratic as time passed. He was often seen pacing late at night, lantern in hand, disappearing behind the house toward that forbidden area. He began keeping detailed lists, not of crops or tools, but of children, names, ages, and notes written in sharp, angry script. After a child vanished, their name would be crossed out. No date of sale, no transfer, just a line through their existence. By the summer of 1856, the number of missing children could no longer be ignored. Entire families were hollowed out by loss. Mothers worked in silence, their faces drained of expression, as if showing emotion might cause the earth itself to open and swallow what little they had left. The plantation, once loud with forced labor and human suffering, took on a different kind of horror, one defined by absence. The absence of laughter, the absence of small voices, the absence of hope. This was the beginning of the nightmare, before anyone from the outside intervened, before records hinted at what lay beneath the ground. To the world beyond the plantation, nothing seemed amiss. But within its boundaries, people lived with the growing certainty that the children had not been sold, had not been moved, and had not escaped. They were still there, somewhere beneath their feet. And whatever was hidden underground was about to become impossible to conceal. What no one outside the plantation understood was that the disappearances weren't random, and they weren't the result of sale or disease. They were part of a space that had been deliberately created, hidden in plain sight, and protected by fear. Beneath the plantation, just beyond the foundation of the main house, there existed an underground structure that few ever saw, and even fewer survived long enough to speak about. It wasn't a cellar, and it wasn't a storm shelter. It was something far more intentional, a place designed to erase sound, light, and eventually, memory. The entrance was concealed behind a heavy wooden hatch covered with dirt and straw, positioned near an unused storage shed. From above, it looked like nothing more than uneven ground. Only the plantation owner and one trusted overseer knew how to open it properly. When lifted, the smell was the first thing that escaped, damp earth mixed with rot and human waste. The ladder leading down was narrow and steep, worn smooth by repeated use. Each rung creaked softly, a sound that echoed far too loudly in the silence below. The underground space itself was larger than anyone would have expected. Dug directly into clay, rich soil, it was reinforced with rough timber beams scavenged from old structures. The walls were uneven and constantly damp, seeping moisture that pooled on the dirt floor. There were no windows, no ventilation beyond a narrow air shaft that barely allowed enough oxygen to keep people alive. The darkness was absolute. Once the hatch closed, there was no sense of time, only cold hunger and fear. This was where the children were taken. They were brought down in silence, often at night, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes carried while asleep. Crying was punished immediately. The plantation owner believed sound was the enemy, proof of disorder, weakness, and defiance. Underground sound behaved differently. Even a whisper traveled, bouncing off the packed earth, magnified and distorted. To prevent this, the children were warned that any noise would bring pain. Over time, they learned to stay silent, even when terrified, even when sick. The space was divided crudely, not with walls but with chains fixed into the beams. Children were restrained in small groups, separated from their siblings and parents. The youngest were kept closest to the center, where the air was worst and the light from the hatch never reached. Food was lowered once a day in small amounts, barely enough to survive. Water came less frequently. There was no bedding, no warmth. Only the ground beneath them, and the steady drip of moisture from the ceiling. Some children didn't last long. Illness spread quickly in the darkness. Fevers went untreated. Cuts became infections. When a child stopped moving, their body was not removed immediately. The living were forced to remain beside the dead until the overseer decided it was time. This wasn't just cruelty, it was control. The owner believed fear preserved order better than chains ever could. Above ground, the plantation functioned as usual. Meals were served. Crops were tended. Guests visited. No one heard screams because there were none. No one saw tears because they were wiped away in the dark. The ground swallowed everything, even sound. Those who suspected something was wrong were silenced quickly. An enslaved man once claimed he heard knocking beneath his feet while repairing a fence. He was accused of drinking and whipped until he recanted. A woman who said she heard her child's voice coming from the earth was told she was mad with grief and locked in a shed for days. The message was clear. The ground was not to be questioned. The most disturbing part was how methodical it all was. The underground space wasn't a moment of madness or a temporary punishment. It was used repeatedly. Logs later discovered showed that children were taken below for weeks at a time, sometimes longer. Some were eventually brought back above ground, pale, silent, and changed. Others never returned at all. Their names were erased from lists, their existence denied. What made the space so difficult to discover was how carefully it was hidden. The hatch was disguised after every use. Soil was packed and smoothed. Straw scattered to match the surrounding ground. Even trained eyes would have missed it, unless they knew exactly where to look. And no one outside the plantation did. But the earth remembers what people try to bury. After heavy rains, the ground above the underground chamber would sink slightly, forming shallow depressions. The soil there stayed colder. Grass refused to grow properly. Animals avoided it instinctively. Horses would shy away, refusing to step across that patch of land, no matter how hard they were pulled. Dogs growled at it. Hackles raised, sensing something wrong beneath the surface. The underground space wasn't just a prison. It was a weapon, a place designed to break families without leaving visible scars. It allowed the plantation owner to punish, to control, and to erase, all while maintaining a respectable appearance to the outside world. The children locked below became ghosts long before anyone officially declared them dead. And this was only the second layer of the horror. Because once the space was finally discovered, what was found inside would prove that the underground chamber was not simply a place of confinement. It was the heart of something far darker. Something that would expose how far cruelty could go when hidden from the light. As the months passed and the underground space continued to swallow children, those left above ground began to sense the truth long before they could prove it. The whispers started quietly, traded only in moments when the overseers were far away, and the night air felt heavy enough to hide secrets. Mothers spoke in fragments, never finishing sentences, afraid that even naming their fear might make it real. "I heard him," one would say. "So did I," another would answer. They all meant the same thing. Sounds that didn't belong on the surface of the earth. It usually happened at night, when the plantation was at its quietest, long after the lamps in the main house were extinguished, when the fields lay still and even the insects seemed to hush. A faint noise would drift through the quarters. It wasn't loud enough to identify clearly, and that was what made it so terrifying. Sometimes it sounded like scratching, other times like a soft thud, rhythmic and slow, as if something beneath the ground was moving, testing the limits of its confinement. And every now and then, just barely audible, there was what sounded like a child trying very hard not to cry. At first, people told themselves it was imagination. Grief does strange things to the mind, especially when children vanish without explanation. But the sounds didn't come from everywhere. They came from one direction. The same forbidden patch of land near the main house. The place overseers warned everyone to avoid. When the wind shifted, the noise seemed to rise directly from beneath it, as though the earth itself were breathing. Older enslaved men, those who had worked the land for decades, knew better than to dismiss what they heard. They recognized the difference between animals burrowing and something human trying to survive. One man said the ground sounded hollow there, like a drum struck softly from below. Another swore he felt vibrations through his feet while hauling water nearby, faint but deliberate, as if someone were knocking in a language made of desperation. Mothers began pressing their ears to the ground when no one was watching. They did it at dawn, at dusk, in the dead of night. They prayed they were wrong. They prayed they were losing their minds. But sometimes, not always, just enough to destroy hope. They heard it. A muffled sob. A weak call. A sound that stopped the moment they reacted, as if whoever made it knew silence was the only way to stay alive. Fear spread faster than certainty. People started avoiding that part of the plantation altogether. Paths shifted. Work slowed. Children who remained above ground were kept close, warned not to wander, not to ask questions, not to cry. Crying had become dangerous. Everyone knew it. Crying meant attention. Crying meant punishment. Crying meant disappearance. One night, a young boy still living in the quarters woke his mother screaming, insisting his sister was calling him from under the floor. She clamped a hand over his mouth before the sound could travel. The next morning, she was questioned by an overseer who claimed someone had heard noise in the night. She denied everything. That evening, she was forced to scrub floors until her hands bled, a reminder of what happened to those who imagined things. But not everyone stayed silent. A field hand named Isaac, known for his quiet nature and careful obedience, made a mistake that would change everything. While repairing a fence near the forbidden area, he dropped a post and heard a sound answer it from below, a sharp, unmistakable knock. Not a cave-in, not an animal, a response. He froze. Then he did the unthinkable. He stomped his foot. The answer came again. Isaac staggered back, his face drained of color. He told no one at first. But that night, unable to carry the weight alone, he whispered what he'd heard to 2 others. By the next evening, the rumor had spread through the quarters like fire through dry grass. The children weren't gone. They were under the ground, alive. The reaction was immediate and dangerous. Some mothers tried to rush the area in the dark, clawing at the soil with bare hands until they were dragged away. Others collapsed, screaming, before they could even take a step. The plantation erupted in panic, and panic attracts attention. Overseers cracked down hard. Patrols increased. Punishments became brutal and public. Anyone caught near the area was accused of plotting rebellion. The owner addressed the enslaved workers directly for the first time in years. He stood above them and spoke of obedience, of discipline, of the dangers of superstition. He called the whispers lies born of weak minds. He warned that anyone spreading rumors would be corrected. That night, 2 men accused of stirring unrest were locked away and never seen again. After that, the whispers changed. They didn't stop, but they became heavier, darker. No longer just fear, but certainty. The sounds from beneath the ground grew weaker over time. Where there had once been knocking, there was only faint movement. Where there had been muffled cries, there was silence. Mothers pressed their ears to the earth and heard nothing at all, and that terrified them more than any sound ever could. The land itself seemed to react. The soil near the hidden space began to sink slightly, forming shallow depressions that never fully dried. After rain, muddy water seeped up through cracks that hadn't been there before. It was as if the ground was trying to give something back, but couldn't. By the time an outside inspection was rumored to be coming, the whispers had almost completely died. Whatever had been alive beneath the plantation was growing quiet, and those who had heard the truth early understood what that silence meant. The underground space had done its job. It had hidden the children, erased their voices, and turned fear into obedience. But the whispers had already done something just as powerful. They had planted certainty in the minds of those who survived. And once people know where the screams are coming from, no amount of silence can ever truly bury them again. By the time the 4th stage unfolded, the plantation had shifted into something colder and more deliberate. What had begun as secrecy hardened into routine, and routine is where cruelty becomes most efficient. The underground space was no longer just a place of hiding. It became a tool. Children were taken there not in moments of panic or rage, but with planning. Names were chosen carefully. Ages mattered. The youngest were favored because their voices were weaker, their resistance easier to break, their memories less likely to survive even if they did. The process followed an unspoken rhythm. A child would be accused of something small, spilling food, wandering too far, crying too loudly. The punishment was announced calmly, almost politely. No spectacle, no public violence, just removal. The child would be led away while others were forced to keep working, eyes down, hands moving, pretending not to notice. That was the real lesson. Survival depended on pretending nothing was happening. What made this phase especially terrifying was how quickly the plantation adjusted. People stopped asking where the children went, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much. Asking meant drawing attention, and attention meant consequences. Mothers learned to swallow questions mid-breath. Fathers clenched their fists until their nails cut skin. Silence became a shared language, heavy and understood. The underground space itself was altered during this time. It wasn't improvised anymore. Boards were reinforced. Openings were concealed beneath movable planks and packed earth. Ventilation was minimal, just enough to prevent immediate death, but not enough to offer comfort. Whoever designed it understood suffering, understood how to keep someone alive long enough to make the experience unforgettable. Children placed there were given no explanation. Confusion did most of the work at first. They cried for parents who could hear them only faintly, if at all. They asked questions no one answered. Time lost meaning. Darkness erased days and nights into a single, endless stretch of fear. Some tried to mark time by counting breaths. Others whispered stories to themselves just to hear a voice. Above ground, the effects spread quietly. Children who remained stopped playing. Laughter vanished from the quarters. Even walking changed, lighter steps, careful movements, as if the ground itself might open. Nighttime became unbearable. Mothers stayed awake listening, not for sounds, but for the absence of them. Silence had become a warning sign. This was also when manipulation replaced force. Overseers began using the underground space as a threat rather than immediate punishment. "You know where bad children go," they'd say softly. No need to explain. The fear was already alive in everyone's mind. Children obeyed faster. Work sped up. Crying stopped almost entirely. The system worked exactly as intended. Some children emerged after days or weeks, changed beyond recognition. They didn't speak much. They avoided light. Sudden noises made them flinch. They clung to adults but never fully relaxed, as if expecting the ground to claim them again. Their return wasn't mercy, it was strategy. Living reminders were more powerful than missing ones. Others never came back at all. Those losses were never acknowledged. No graves, no names spoken aloud. But everyone remembered. Each disappearance tightened the grip of fear around the plantation. The underground space didn't need to be used often anymore. Its existence alone was enough. The psychological damage spread across generations in real time. Parents became distant, not from lack of love, but from constant terror. Loving too openly felt dangerous. Bonding felt risky when separation could happen without warning. Children learned early that attachment invited pain. This emotional numbness was not accidental. It was a byproduct the system relied on. What makes this stage especially disturbing is how ordinary it began to feel. Horror loses its shock when repeated quietly. The plantation continued operating. Crops were planted and harvested. Meals were cooked. Life went on above ground, while unimaginable suffering persisted below it. That contrast is what allowed the cruelty to last. Normalcy became its camouflage. Even the land seemed to absorb the damage. Areas near the hidden space grew barren, as if the soil itself rejected what lay beneath. Workers noticed tools rusted faster there. Wood rotted strangely. Animals avoided it. Superstitions formed, but no one dared connect them openly to the children. Naming the truth still felt too dangerous. By the end of this phase, the underground space had achieved its purpose completely. It no longer needed screams or resistance. Fear had settled into the bones of everyone who lived there. Control was no longer enforced daily. It was internalized. People obeyed not because they were watched, but because they remembered. And that is the most chilling part of all. The underground space didn't just punish children, it reshaped the behavior of an entire plantation. It taught silence, erased protest, and turned survival into submission. Long after the doors were sealed and the ground smoothed over, its impact remained, carried in the posture of the workers, the quiet of the nights, and the way no one ever again trusted the earth beneath their feet. By the final stage, the truth could no longer stay buried, no matter how carefully the ground above it was smoothed. What exposed everything was not an investigation, not a confession, and not an act of courage from those trapped inside the system. It was collapse, both literal and moral. After weeks of heavy rain, the soil near the unused shed began to sink more than usual. A shallow depression turned into a visible cave. And with it came a smell so powerful that it stopped work across the plantation. It wasn't the scent of wet earth. It was decay. At first, the overseers tried to dismiss it. They blamed animals, rotting roots, old trash pits. But the ground continued to give way. Boards cracked. Mud slid inward. When one worker's foot broke through the surface and vanished into darkness below, panic finally broke the long silence. He was pulled free, screaming about chains, bones, and something cold grabbing his ankle. For the first time, fear rose above obedience. The hatch could no longer be hidden. Rain had washed away the careful disguise of dirt and straw. The outline of the opening became clear to anyone who looked. When it was finally forced open in daylight, what lay beneath silenced even the men who had enforced its use. The underground chamber was smaller than memory had made it, but far worse in reality. Chains still hung from beams. Scraps of cloth clung to rusted iron. The floor was layered with old stains that no amount of time could erase. There were remains, small ones. Some were buried beneath collapsed earth. Others lay where they had fallen, indistinguishable from the dirt except for bone. There were no markers, no order, no dignity, just evidence of children who had been left to disappear. The air shaft had long since clogged, explaining why some had not survived even a few days. It was clear that this was not an accident or excess. It was design. Word spread faster than anyone could control it. Enslaved families didn't need confirmation. They already knew. Mothers recognized scraps of fabric they had sewn themselves. Fathers identified carved marks on wooden beams, counting notches, names scratched by tiny hands. The grief that followed was not loud. It was deep, shaking, and final. People cried without sound, the way they had learned to do underground. Outside attention followed soon after, drawn not by compassion, but by disruption. The collapse interfered with production. Neighbors whispered. Travelers noticed the tension. Once questions started, they couldn't be fully stopped. Those responsible tried to shift blame, claiming ignorance, blaming dead overseers, calling it an old structure no longer in use. But the evidence was too recent, too deliberate, and yet justice did not come the way anyone might hope. Records show no proper trial for the children, no public accounting of their deaths, no acknowledgement of the families destroyed. The plantation owner faced scrutiny, but consequences were minimal. Fines, warnings, quiet transfers of property. The system that allowed the underground chamber to exist was the same system deciding how to respond to it. Accountability was carefully limited. What did change was behavior. The underground space was sealed permanently, not out of remorse, but out of fear of discovery. Dirt was packed. Timber burned. The shed was torn down. The ground was flattened as if trying to erase not just the structure, but the memory. But memory doesn't work that way. For those who survived, The damage was lifelong. Children who had been taken underground and returned never fully rejoined the world above. They struggled with light, sound, and trust. Many grew into adults who avoided enclosed spaces, who startled at footsteps, who woke screaming from dreams they couldn't explain. Parents carried guilt that had no solution, guilt for surviving, for not protecting, for staying silent when silence was forced upon them. Even after the plantation changed hands, the land retained its reputation. New workers refused to sleep near the former site. Tools left there went missing. Animals avoided it. Stories spread quietly, passed from one generation to the next, stripped of details but heavy with warning. Don't go there, elders would say. The ground remembers. The most haunting part is how easily it could have been forgotten. If not for the rain, if not for erosion, if not for one misstep that broke through the surface. The children did not die in a dramatic revolt or a public execution. They were erased slowly, quietly, underground, relying on the world above to keep looking away. Keynote 5 isn't about discovery alone. It's about what happens after discovery, how truth can be seen and still not fully answered for, how evidence can surface and still be buried again through indifference. The underground chamber was sealed, but the consequences were never resolved. The suffering didn't end with exposure. It simply changed form, and that is what makes this story endure. Not just the cruelty, but the reminder that systems built on silence don't collapse all at once. They crack slowly, often revealing their horrors only by accident. The children locked underground were denied names, voices, and graves, but the land itself refused to keep their secret forever. What was buried came back up, and even now, long after the soil settled again, the story remains as proof that some truths, no matter how deeply hidden, will always find a way to surface. Long after the underground space was sealed and the plantation attempted to return to routine, something had permanently shifted that no repair could undo. The physical structure was gone, but its influence lingered in ways that were impossible to measure and even harder to escape. The people who lived through it carried the experience inside them, shaping how they spoke, how they loved, and how they survived. The cruelty had ended in form, but not in effect. Children who grew up after the chamber was closed still felt its shadow. They were raised by adults who had learned that attachment was dangerous and silence was protection. Stories were not told directly, but warnings were passed down in fragments. Certain places were avoided without explanation. Certain questions were discouraged before they were even asked. Fear had become inherited, passed from parent to child without needing words. Those who had been inside the underground space rarely spoke of it, even years later. When they did, their memories came out disjointed, sensations rather than narratives. The smell of wet earth, the sound of breathing in the dark, the way time seemed to stretch until it stopped meaning anything at all. Many couldn't remember how long they had been there, only that it felt endless. Their trauma didn't fit neatly into stories, which made it easier for others to ignore. Some survivors struggled to function in ordinary life. Enclosed spaces triggered panic. Darkness brought back the feeling of being trapped. Sudden silence felt threatening rather than peaceful. These reactions were often dismissed as weakness or stubbornness, never recognized as the scars of deliberate abuse. There was no language for trauma, and certainly no space for healing. Families were permanently altered. Parents who had lost children underground carried grief that never found release. There were no funerals, no graves, no acknowledgement of loss. Mourning had to be done quietly, internally, often alone. That kind of grief doesn't fade, it hardens. It changes how people see the world, making hope feel risky and joy feel temporary. The plantation itself gained a reputation that followed it for decades. Even after ownership changed, workers spoke of it in hushed tones. People claimed to hear sounds at night, knocking, crying, movement beneath the ground. Whether real or imagined, those stories kept the truth alive in ways official records never did. Folklore became a substitute for justice, preserving memory when law and history refused to. Visitors noticed something was wrong, even if they couldn't name it. The land felt heavy. Certain areas seemed colder, quieter. Crops near the former underground site never grew properly. Animals behaved strangely, refusing to graze or rest there. These details fed rumors, but they also reflected a deeper reality. The environment itself had been shaped by prolonged suffering. What's most unsettling is how close the plantation came to erasing everything completely. If the collapse hadn't happened, if the rain had come differently, if one step hadn't broken through the surface, the underground chamber might never have been discovered at all. The children would have vanished without evidence. The system would have continued uninterrupted. History would have remained clean on paper and filthy beneath the ground. Even after exposure, the lack of accountability sent a powerful message. It told survivors that their pain was acknowledged only insofar as it disrupted productivity. It told future generations that cruelty could be hidden, uncovered, and still largely forgiven. That message didn't stay confined to one plantation. It echoed across an entire society built on exploitation. Yet, despite all efforts to suppress it, the truth endured. Not in court records or official reports, but in memory, in the way elders warned children, in the way people flinched at certain sounds, in the way no one ever stood comfortably on that patch of land again. Memory became resistance, even when spoken softly. Keynote 6 is about that endurance, about how harm doesn't end when the door is sealed or the ground smoothed over. It continues through behavior, through fear, through silence passed down like an inheritance. The underground space succeeded in controlling bodies for a time, but it failed to erase what it created. Because even when justice doesn't arrive, even when names are lost and graves never marked, stories survive. And those stories, carried forward despite fear and suppression, become the only form of accountability left. The children locked underground were denied everything in life, but they were not denied remembrance. The land tried to bury them. The system tried to forget them. But memory proved stronger than both.